Today, we're joined by Colonel Richard Kemp, one of the world's leading military minds and one of Israel's strongest and most fearless defenders. Colonel Kemp, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
Colonel Kemp, for those meeting you for the first time, who are you and what led you into a life of military service?
Well, I'm a Brit, as you can probably work out from the accent. I left school one day and joined the army the next day. I left high school one day. I didn't go to university. I'd always intended to be a soldier ever since I can remember. I never had any other choice in life, and so I did. I started off as a private soldier in the British Army, and then shortly after that went to Sandhurst, trained to become an officer. And thereafter I served about 30 years, including in Northern Ireland, the Balkans, Afghanistan, Iraq, and a few other places. Spent quite a lot of time in Germany during the Cold War, very little time in the UK. And I served alongside the United States forces on many occasions during my military career. And I ended up, the last 5 or so years of my military service was spent working in the Cabinet Office in Britain, which is essentially the Prime Minister's office. And in that role, I was working on international terrorism intelligence, also responsible for the intelligence coordination of an organization called COBRA, which is the British National Crisis Management Committee. And then after that, I worked in corporate security for a while. Nowadays, I write in British and international press. I do media commentary. I do some consultancy work.
What first connected you personally to Israel? Was there a defining moment when your admiration turned into active support? Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Well, I'd always admired and had great respect for Israel and the IDF ever since I can remember, ever since sort of seeing and reading about the actions of the IDF in, for example, the 1973 war, the Yom Kippur War. And we studied the IDF in great detail in the British Army, trying to learn lessons from the way that they conducted, first of all, armored warfare against the Arabs, and secondly, counter-terrorist activity, which became more dominant, obviously, in more recent years. So that's the kind of background to it. But my more direct involvement of Israel came during the period I was working, as I mentioned, in the Prime Minister's Office on International Terrorism Intelligence. And frankly, when I took over the job, which was straight after 9/11, I knew nothing really about jihadism and Islamist terrorism. And I knew a lot about Irish terrorism. I spent a lot of my military career serving in Northern Ireland, fighting against Irish terrorists, but not jihadism. And so I had a great deal to learn when I took over that responsibility. And I learned a great deal of that from Israel, other countries as well, but predominantly from Israel. And we worked very closely. We shared a lot of intelligence. We shared operational techniques. We shared our understanding. Many people don't necessarily recognize this, but it was true then, and it's still true today, that Israel and Britain are extremely close, have an extremely close intelligence relationship, probably closer than almost any other country with the exception of the United States. And also a very close military relationship, particularly at the top levels and in terms of military equipment and operational techniques, exactly that. But I've certainly made it clear that the IDF they fight in a lawful and moral way, as do the British and the American forces and other Western forces. I've observed the IDF in action over many years, particularly in Gaza. I've seen the way they fight. I understand the way they fight. And I've spoken to many IDF soldiers, so I know for sure that their operational techniques and their standards of operation are based on, obviously, strong effectiveness against the enemy in defense of their country, but also the laws of war. And not only that, but the morality of war. I've spoken to many IDF soldiers who have told me stories themselves about their actions in combat in the face of an enemy that uses its civilian population as human shields, or more accurately, perhaps human sacrifices, because Hamas, as well as other jihadist organizations in Gaza and in other parts of the world, they want to use their civilian population as weapons. They want the IDF to kill their civilians. That's what they want. It's not something that is incidental to them. It's part of their whole strategy to bring global criticism, condemnation, vilification, isolation down upon Israel as a result of the deaths of innocent civilians in Gaza and elsewhere. And talking to IDF soldiers, I'll give you a couple of examples, one of which I spoke to a IDF pilot who's actually British, who was made Aliyah, in other words, he moved to Israel and was serving in the IDF. He was telling me that they carried out, on one occasion in a previous Gaza conflict, they carried out numerous attempts to strike a target, but each time they got to the target, there were too many civilians there to risk attacking. And so they didn't attack, and they aborted the attack each time and eventually abandoned the operation. And I said to him, that must have been deeply frustrating for you. And he said, no, it's not frustrating for me. He said, this is the way the IDF fights. And he said, I'm a father, I've got a couple of kids at home. How could I possibly go home and face them knowing that I'd killed innocent civilians if I didn't actually have to? So that's one example. And I think that is the way that many IDF soldiers, most IDF soldiers, think about these things. On another occasion, in the recent Gaza, the current Gaza conflict, you could say, the 2-year war that's been going on since October the 7th, 2023, I've been into Gaza several times. On one occasion, I attended a command group meeting inside Gaza by a formation that was planning an attack against a high-value target in Gaza. The meeting lasted for about an hour in the ruins of a house that had been blown up one way or the other. Much of the hour, at least, let's say 20 to 30 minutes of that hour, was taken up by the commanders, the general, the colonels, the other commanders there, trying to figure out how to effectively deal with this target, with terrorists who were inside a school that had been turned into a refugee shelter. So how to take out these terrorists while minimizing the chances of killing innocent civilians. And that struck me as being fairly significant because all this time was taken, and eventually they came up with some novel techniques about how to do it while minimizing civilian casualties.
Recently, you spoke on the BBC about possible conscription in the British Army. And the moment you mentioned Israel, the host, I guess, got flustered. Or can you speak a little about what happened over there?
Yeah, I did a radio interview for the BBC, as you say, about the prospects for conscription and how it might work in the British forces if we decide we have to do that. I personally don't think it's very likely we will, but it's a topic that's discussed from time to time in the UK. And among other things, I gave a few examples about how other nations addressed conscription. For example, France recently has introduced or is introducing a new form of national service, not exactly conscription. But I also spoke about how Israel does it. Obviously, Israel is a conscript army supported by large numbers of reservists. And the minute I mentioned Israel, without going into any operational detail of any sort, just their organization, starting to talk about their organization for conscription, immediately the interviewer said to me, yeah, but they're accused of doing some really terrible things. Nothing to do with what I was talking about. I was talking about the kind of infrastructure and the techniques for recruiting soldiers into the army, not about what the army's doing. It was almost like a trigger word. You mention Israel on the BBC, and they've got to say something damning about Israel if they possibly can. And that's not just that. That's one example, and you can watch the BBC anytime when the subject of Israel comes up, and the same bias and the same, what I would class to an extent as vitriol, comes out of the BBC presenters, who are supposed to be even-handed, they're supposed to be objective, and my taxes pay for them. They pay for them. They should be. They have a duty to be objective, but they're not, as we've seen with recent attempts on their part to slur and to distort the words, for example, of President Trump.
Why does telling the truth about Israel threaten their narrative so deeply? Do you think their anti-Israel posture is ideological, political, driven by fear of offending radical, Islamic elements, or is it something else?
I think in the case of the BBC, it's and it's not just the BBC. There are organizations like Sky News, which have very similar policies and attitudes towards Israel, and other media organizations in the UK, as in the United States. But they, as I say, it's political and ideological. And what drives it is the prevailing narrative against Israel that essentially says Israel is an illegitimate country. Israel should not really exist. It's stolen Arab land. It illegally occupies Arab land. It practices apartheid. It practices genocide. All of these things which have crept, not just crept, but have surged into the BBC, into the narrative, into the general narrative, not just the BBC. Of course, all of those, every single one of those things, every single point I just mentioned is an absolute lie. There is no illegal occupation. There is no genocide. There is no apartheid. There is no land theft. It's all lies. But this is what is commonly believed and propagated by the likes of the BBC. And where it comes from, it's become just kind of a natural way of thinking about Israel, which is what the first thing in certainly in the media and political elites think of when they think of Israel. In many cases, not every case, but I think it's maintained and it gained in growth because of the type of people that are employed by the BBC and in other media organizations. And that type of people are predominantly, they're left-leaning and they're graduates, university graduates. And if you're left-leaning in Britain today anyway, your instinct is against Israel. And if you're a university graduate, you have been indoctrinated by left-leaning university professors, faculties, etc. And you're going to come out of those universities unless you're a uniquely and unusually objective-minded person who actually is capable of thinking for themselves rather than just following the narrative of the professors. Then you're going to come out of that with an anti-Israel slant. It's very hard to avoid it, and that's what you have. And of course, the BBC, the BBC recruit like-minded people. I've done a lot of interviews on the BBC over the years, and I've met many BBC employees. And it's very hard to come upon anyone who is not quite strongly anti-Israel and twists everything against Israel. And as I say, it's not really a surprise because of where these people come from and what their mind has been infected by.
Do you think the rise of anti-Israel sentiment, in Britain and around the world is connected to decades of Muslim Brotherhood influence and indoctrination? And how deeply, do you think it's infiltrated the UK institutions, the media, the political culture?
Yeah, I think the Muslim Brotherhood and other extreme Islamist organizations have been obviously very deliberately working to, among other things, and it's not just connected to Israel, but among other things, but particularly Israel probably, to shape the thinking and the actions of our country to suit their, we know what their agenda is only too well. And that has influenced not just media, of course, but it's also influenced politicians. And our political leadership today is influenced not just by the propaganda and the actions of the Muslim Brotherhood and the like, but also by a very significant and growing anti-Israel population among not only the left, but also among Islamists in the UK, among those people who are probably either a recent or even longer term second, even third generation immigrants in some cases from Muslim countries. And it's very unusual to find anybody who has their origins in the Muslim world who is not very, very ill-disposed towards Israel. They're kind of almost born with it. Certainly, they acquire it very, very quickly after they're born. And there are a lot of them. There's a growing Islamic population in the UK, a growing left-leaning population, particularly among the young people. And this is extremely important for our politicians because particularly the Labour Party, which is the current government in the UK, they depend so heavily on many of these people for support. And the Labour Party is a weak government now. It's got a very strong majority in the House of Commons, but it's nevertheless extremely unpopular in the country as a whole. Probably one of the most unpopular governments that's ever been in office in Britain. And they think they need anyway, the support of the Islamic population. And of course, the left-leaning population is fundamental to their support. So their actions are driven by that. For example, the decision by the current Starmer government in London to do a partial ban on export of military technology to Israel and to recognize the so-called Palestinian state. Those things, neither of those two things are based upon foreign policy realities. They're all based upon domestic politics. It's all driven because these people know, people like Keir Starmer, his defense secretary, his intelligence, organizations, foreign ministry, they all know fully and understand the reality of what's going on in Israel, what Israel has been doing in Gaza, along the lines that I described earlier on in this conversation. They know that. They know it. And so they're not basically shaping their policies on the basis of reality. They're shaping them on the basis of political expediency.
You've said that the Soviet Union engineered a global anti-Israel propaganda campaign in the 1960s. Can you walk us through exactly what the Soviets did and how that disinformation still shapes today's anti-Israel movements?
Yeah, this was Operation SIG, which was a deliberate political warfare operation organized from Moscow, intended to use Israel as a weapon against the West, against predominantly back in the 1960s, against the United States and the UK, who were the two main Western powers in the Middle East. And they wanted, they'd hoped that Israel would side with the Soviet Union, but it didn't. Israel aligned itself more closely with the West back in the early days after the recreation of the State of Israel. And after the 1967 war, particularly after the 1967 war, when Israel achieved such miraculous success in defense of their own country, and to an extent before that, but particularly afterwards, Operation SIG came into play. And the idea was to turn what was a religious war by Muslims against Jews to drive the Jews out of the land. They wanted to turn a religious war into a war of national liberation because they felt, the Soviets, they felt that religion was increasingly unpopular in the West, would lack traction, a religious war wouldn't get much support in the West, whereas a war of national liberation would. And so they created something called the Palestinian people. Up until the kind of mid-60s, probably, Arabs did not identify as Palestinian people. It was more the Jews in the period before the recreation of the State of Israel who saw themselves as Palestinians in the British Mandate for Palestine, which existed after the First World War. So they had to invent an identity for these people who were fighting for their national liberation, and that was the Palestinian identity. And the Palestinian National Charter was written in Moscow by the KGB with the assistance of Egypt. And the rest kind of developed from there. And the Soviets invested vast millions of rubles into creating this national liberation movement, sent operatives, they recruited agents in the Middle East and around the world to spread this campaign. And it was incredibly successful. By the way, this wasn't the only place they did it. They did the similar type of campaigns in different parts of the world, again, direct against the West. But their most successful campaign was Operation SIG in the Middle East. And it was, although it was directed overall from Romania played the key role in this operation. And things like Israel is an apartheid state, genocide, all of this stuff originated back then. And all of the narrative that again, that I said earlier on about land theft and illegal occupation, all this stuff, that all came from that Operation SIG, has simply developed and blossomed. And you know, when you hear university students on campuses chanting "From the river to the sea," when you hear them spreading their lies about Israel, and not just on the campuses, in the streets and in the media, etc., all of that is them kind of miming former Soviet Union propaganda. So it's been phenomenally successful, and it's just, I mean, you know, a lot of people think the accusations of genocide began during this last 2 years. They didn't. I was in Australia about 5-6 years ago, I think it was, maybe a bit longer than that even. And I was speaking at a university in Sydney, and there was a bunch of students protesting my speech at the university, which wasn't actually anything to do with Israel, funnily enough. But they nevertheless decided to protest it because they identified me with Israel. And the chant that was ringing out outside and inside even the lecture hall was, "Colonel Kemp, you can't hide, you support genocide." So the genocide stuff has not been newly invented. It's been there for a long time. And we know why it is, because the Jews, of course, were subjected to the most horrific genocide in the Second World War. And of course, that how better to attack them than to accuse them of doing to other people what was done to themselves.
Qatar hosts Hamas leaders, runs Al Jazeera, but also hosts major US and UK military bases. How does Qatar get away with playing all sides at once?
Well, it's relatively simple, and it's all about money. And Qatar is obviously a very wealthy Gulf state, and I wouldn't even like to hazard a guess at the extent of investments that exist here in the US, as well as, of course, in European countries, including the UK. And of course, they're one of the principal sponsors, if not the principal sponsor these days, of Hamas. And so they're able, because of their financial influence and clout around the world, particularly in the US, they're able to play both sides, and they do that very effectively. And I think there are people in our government, in the State Department, and even in the White House, and in other parts of the government, who actually would like to believe that Qatar is on our side. They want to believe that. And they will even, I think, and I've worked in governmental organizations before, including some very close work with the US government in the past, that they are, bureaucrats in particular, in our civil services, and of course they influence the political decision making to a very large extent. They are willing to overlook what people tell them about the reality of Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood and other anti-American, anti-Western entities in order to bring about what they see as being solutions in the interests of the United States or in the interests of the UK or whatever. And I think we lack, in many parts of our governments, we lack deep expertise. And those people who have the deep expertise of organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood and Qatar, their voices probably are not strong enough to be heard. So a lot of the decisions are taken by people who lack the knowledge and expertise, and maybe hold out hope rather than reality as a strategy.
When Israel targeted the Hamas, operatives on Qatari soil, and then they missed, Qatar protested, and Washington reprimanded Israel. What does that reveal about Qatar's leverage over the West, and is the U.S. more bonded with Qatar than it is with Israel?
I don't believe so. No, I think that the whole picture is a lot more complicated than the media and some diplomats would like us to believe, and politicians. When you hear President Trump forced Prime Minister Netanyahu to do this or that, and we hear it in different ways, not just over the Qatar strike, I think you have to take it with a pinch of salt, because their relationship, as I understand it, there is almost no daylight between the White House and the government of Israel on this particular situation, almost no daylight. And so when, it's going to be more helpful, I think, if a decision is taken that in order to get the government of Qatar to apply pressure towards Hamas in order to get them to accept Trump's 20-point, it's much more useful if Netanyahu is forced to do something rather than he does it voluntarily, both from the point of view of America being seen to flex its muscles and from the point of view of the domestic audience in Israel. So I think we shouldn't take that too seriously. And I think, it was an extremely important move, which Prime Minister Netanyahu, the genius that he is, despite, what a lot of people say about him, he's actually proven in this war to have been a quite remarkable military leader who has achieved things that no one else, I don't think, could have achieved. He would have recognized the importance of that in order to help bring about the 20-point peace plan. And that plan was very important, obviously, because we've now seen the release of almost all of the Israeli hostages. That couldn't have happened, I don't think, without Qatar's acquiescence. Among other things, there are other factors, of course, as well. And President Trump's support for Israel and his driving of this plan played an absolutely critical role, of course. But I think one fundamental thing that made a difference, which brought about the situation we're in today, which is not, it's not the best possible situation, but I think it's the best situation that could have been achieved given the realities, was the strike on Qatar. I think that was absolutely pivotal and fundamental to what's happening today, because it terrified the Qatari government. Qatar obviously their economic stability, their security stability in the Middle East is very, very important to them. And this was threatened by the strike, not against the Qatari government, not against Qatar as a country, but against the terrorist leadership that had refuge in Qatar. And the other, I think, that was one of the fundamental actions that led to the situation we've got today. And the other fundamental action that led directly to it as well was Israel's all-out offensive against Gaza City, which many people, including, the Prime Minister of the UK, other Western governments in Europe, etc., did their best to try and tell Israel they shouldn't be doing. Nevertheless, Israel launched that operation, and when it did, Hamas realized the game was up. They knew that if Israel continued to drive forward in Gaza City and beyond, there wouldn't be any Hamas left. So again, combined with the pressure from Qatar, that led directly to the situation we've got today. The same third contributing factor, slightly more distant now, was the 12-day war against Iran, which also played into this whole picture extremely effectively. And if you think about it, all of these things, obviously no one could try and warn Israel not to strike Qatar because they didn't know it was going to happen. Hardly anyone knew it was going to happen, including inside the Israeli defense establishment and the US defense establishment. Think of the number of people who said it was totally wrong to strike Iran, Israel and the US attacks against Iran in the 12-day war, totally wrong. Think of the number of people who said it was totally wrong to launch an all-out offensive against Gaza City. And they were totally wrong themselves. Because there's too much, to my mind, too much thinking in the West today, and particularly in Europe, of appeasement, compromise, and not looking towards achieving a victory. And when you're fighting an organization like Hamas, and pretty much any enemy as well, and the same goes for Russia, you don't achieve anything by compromising with them, by appeasing them. You only achieve it by hard military strength. And that's what's happened. And we've seen the outcome. It's not, like I said, we're not in a perfect situation now over Gaza, but we're in a very much better one than we were a few months ago.
Speaking of Gaza, you've been inside Gaza, I believe, multiple times during the war. What are some of the biggest truths you witness on the ground that the world refuses to acknowledge?
Well, I think the first thing, not to dwell on it any longer, but is the extent to which the IDF have conducted operations to minimize civilian casualties. And that is because facts don't really matter in this narrative. No matter what you or I say or anyone else says is going to convince people that's true, but it is true nevertheless. And Israeli soldiers have died in Gaza as part of the Israeli military operation to minimize civilian casualties, Gazan civilian casualties. The other big issue, of course, is starvation, and that feeds into this genocide narrative, and it's again false. We've seen images of starving babies in Gaza, and when you analyze most of those images, if not all of those images carefully, you can see that there's a very badly emaciated young child surrounded by fat people, by their family who are fat. And it turns out a lot of the time that this poor child, and we all obviously feel great pity for the child concerned, it's nothing to do with starvation by Israel. It's all to do with, let's say, pre-existing or contracted medical conditions, not connected with starvation. Otherwise, how do you explain that the young child is starving, yet the mother's sitting there, a big fat woman? It's very difficult to reconcile that. And the reality is that Israel delivered vastly, or facilitated the delivery into Gaza of vastly more humanitarian aid, particularly food, than was available to the Gazans before this war began. And it's the first time in history that any armed forces have taken such great efforts to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid into the enemy population at a time when they're still fighting against it. And it's never happened before. Israel did it. Israel built new roads, opened new entry points for aid, did everything they could to facilitate the aid. Yet still, they're accused of starvation. And of course, there's a very good reason to restrict and prevent humanitarian getting into Gaza, which is the fact that it is seized by the enemy fighters, by Hamas, seized and used for their own military purposes, and then sold to the Gazan population at vastly exorbitant prices to raise money for themselves to fight Israel, and also to control the civilian population, to make it harder for Israel to succeed. Now, those reasons alone would justify far, far greater withholding of food than actually occurred. And the third thing, I suppose, really is the vast scale of destruction inside Gaza, which I've certainly witnessed, and many people who haven't actually been into Gaza have seen aerial and ground photography of some of this destruction, vast destruction, not on an unprecedented scale, but on a very large scale. People ask why. Well, there are very good reasons why that had to happen. It wasn't because Israel wanted to destroy Gaza, to see every building turned into a pile of rubble. Of course they didn't. Why would they want to do that? Makes no sense at all. But first point, most of Hamas's fighters are either underground in tunnels, or they're fighting from within civilian buildings, whether it's houses, apartment blocks, mosques, schools, refugee centers, whatever it might be. That's where they fight from. They use this to shield themselves. And if you're going to defend your country against its enemy, then you have to kill them where they are. You're not going to say, well, please move out into the open and we'll fire a missile at you there. You've got to kill them where they are, and that is often in buildings. And the other main reason why there's so much destruction of buildings inside Gaza is because so much of the whole place, the urban areas, have been booby-trapped. In the floors, under the floors, in the walls, in the ceilings, in the pavements outside, the sidewalks, I think you Americans call it, outside the buildings. Everywhere, almost everywhere, is booby-trapped. I think it's I don't know the exact proportion of buildings that were booby-trapped, but I know a lot of them were, a hell of a lot of them were. I've seen some of the booby-traps, and I've seen buildings used as weapon storage, but I've seen boxes of grenades under children's beds. I've seen rocket launchers in a kitchen cupboard. I've seen tunnel entrances in civilian houses that go down to where the terrorists are operating from. So what's the answer? I mean, people who criticize the way Israel's fought the war, many of them, they criticize it without giving an alternative. So what is Israel supposed to do? Is it supposed to send soldiers into these buildings to deal with the booby traps? Many of these booby traps, explosive booby traps, are covered by covert cameras. So the minute a soldier is seen approaching, somebody on a phone a long way off can press a button and detonate. Why would the IDF go into booby trap buildings knowing the likelihood they're booby trapped rather than just destroying them? You would destroy them. An IDF soldier's life is worth no less than anyone else's lives, and commanders have an absolute responsibility to preserve their soldiers' lives, not just a moral responsibility, but also a responsibility in terms of preserving combat power to carry out your operation. And I've not directly and personally been involved in operations quite like this, but I can just give you one small example from my own experience, where there was a group of buildings in an urban area in West Belfast, buildings were being refurbished. And they'd been extensively booby-trapped by the IRA. I think they had something like 15, 20 booby-trapped devices concealed inside these buildings, with the deliberate intention of luring soldiers into the buildings and blowing them up when they got in there. Now, fortunately, we were able to recognize what had happened before any soldiers went in and got killed. And we did everything we could to try and use remote detonation devices, etc., to deal with these booby traps. But the problem was so tough, so intense, that it couldn't work. So we had to end up blowing the building up by using explosives inside the buildings. So that's it's not that comparable, but it's the closest I've got from my own experience to explain why these buildings have been destroyed to such a huge extent. And I think those are probably the three things that I've seen inside Gaza from my personal perspective and my personal experience. I can really justify what the IDF has done there. And just another observation I'll make, I visited the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is an American charitable organization which was set up to get aid into Gaza directly to the population of Gaza without it falling into the hands of Hamas, which almost all of the rest of the aid that goes in there does. So the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, very successful, and of course attacked from all sides for what they were doing because it was undermining Hamas's plans, yet it was getting aid to the civilian population, yet it was attacked by the UN and it was attacked by Hamas. So what does that tell you about the UN and Hamas and the way they work together? But nevertheless, they were very successful. I spoke to a lot of Gazans. I must have spoken to a couple of hundred Gazan civilians inside Gaza during my visits to the GHF sites a number of times. And for many of them, it was the first time since the war began, and this is kind of 18 months into the war, something like that, that they'd actually received any free aid at all. The other humanitarian aid that had got to them, they'd had to buy it. Free aid provided by your taxes and my taxes and other people's taxes, yet it's then sold at profit by Hamas for people to buy. So they were astonished by that. And the other thing that many of them said to me was, we love President Trump. We love America. And when they said that, many people around them agreed with it. It was a bit of a chant in some ways. Now, that's not the perspective you would expect to hear from kids and adults as well inside Gaza. And the other cry that I heard most often was, we hate Hamas. And whenever anyone said we hate Hamas, there were a lot of cheers from the people around them. And of course, they're saying, a lot of them are saying this to me. Some speak English, but a lot of them are saying it through interpreters. Now, obviously, you can't tell the extent to which they're saying it because they know whether they knew I was British or thought I was American or what the hell they thought I was, I don't know. But I think that explains a certain amount. And the other observation I made from talking to, as I say, a couple of hundred Gazans, was almost all of them wanted to leave Gaza. They wanted to get out of Gaza into Egypt. And that's totally understandable after 18 months of war, death, and destruction. Of course they'd want to. They didn't want to stay there. The problem was Egypt wouldn't let anyone out. And I hold Egypt as a country more responsible for civilian deaths in Gaza than I hold Israel responsible for those. The primary responsibility for every death, every building destroyed, everyone who's gone hungry is Hamas, primarily. But number 2 on that list, I would say, is Egypt, because Egypt has a legal obligation under the African Union Refugee Convention and under International Refugee Convention to open its borders when civilians are threatened in a war zone adjacent to it. It has a legal obligation to do that. It wouldn't do it. It would not do it. Now, if it had, think of the probably tens of thousands of people whose lives would have been saved if they'd been able to escape temporarily into Egypt to take refuge away from the fighting. The thing that I think that's even more concerning for me than that is that which countries stood up and said, Egypt, open your borders? Did the United Nations Secretary General call on that to happen? No, he didn't. Did Britain, did Germany, did France, did any other Western country call on Egypt to open its borders? No, they didn't. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for it is because these countries, they wanted to use, this sounds a terrible thing to say, but it's true, in my view, they wanted to use those Gazan civilians as human shields, just like Hamas did, because they wanted those civilians to stay there in order to prevent Israel from achieving its objectives in Gaza and destroying Hamas. It's chilling to think about, but I believe it is true.
So you just answered a bunch of my questions. Speaking of the United Nations, why would they oppose or undermine these humanitarian efforts? We know why Hamas resisted the aid reaching civilians. Can you go into detail why the United Nations would do this?
Well, UNRWA obviously is the organization that is primarily responsible for humanitarian aid inside Gaza. UNRWA directly and also with various other agencies that support it and that aid it. And we know what UNRWA is. UNRWA is simply a weapon against Israel. That's what it is for. That's what it was set up for. It was set up as a completely separate refugee organization for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which deals with every other refugee anywhere in the world. But no, we had to have a special one for UNRWA, Israel, oblique Palestine, so-called, because it was a weapon against Israel. It wanted to perpetuate the refugee crisis had occurred from 1948 onwards, when huge numbers of Arabs, in most cases, voluntarily left Israel, having been told by the invading Arab armies to leave, and then when we conquered Israel, you can come back. That created a huge refugee situation. And UNRWA was set up to perpetuate that, to make sure that those people stayed refugees. They're the only refugees who are perpetual refugees. And you can be the grandson of somebody who was born in Judea and Samaria or the West Bank, or born in Gaza, and left that country and is now in the United States and has children and grandchildren. You can be the grandchild who's never been outside the US, who is still a refugee. They're living in the American system. They're Americans, but they're still refugees from so-called Palestine. It wasn't just about that. It was partly about that. In order to perpetuate this right of return of vast numbers of refugees, in order to swamp Israel effectively. But also education, welfare, medical care, all of these things were in the hands of UNRWA. A lot of them were. And the education in particular was indoctrination. It was anti-Israel indoctrination by UNRWA, in UNRWA schools, using our funds, using money provided by American taxpayers and European taxpayers to get textbooks published and to get films made and to get teachers trained who were going to turn young Gazans, young Palestinians against Israel. And that's why we see such a radicalization of the population there. And of course, the majority of the employees of UNRWA are locals. They're not Americans, they're not Europeans, they're not Africans, they're no one else. They're local people who themselves have been indoctrinated, and in many cases took part in the attacks on the 7th of October, directly UNRWA employees. And in many cases, or in some cases, UNRWA employees held Israeli hostages inside Gaza. So it's a question that you don't really need to ask the question as to why the UN, dominated in the case of Gaza by UNRWA, why the UN is on the side of Hamas and against Israel.
So with the hostages now home, how does this reshape Israel's military objectives and operational freedom? And in your view, what do you think is the realistic model for Gaza's future in terms of governance, security, de-radicalization?
Well, the recovery of the hostages is a major turning point. The war that we've seen since the 7th of October would not have gone on for that length of time if it hadn't been for the Israeli hostages held inside Gaza. That was a major factor influencing Israeli operations, which slowed it down to a huge extent. There were other factors as well, but I think that was the main one. So with that situation now completely changed, it gives the IDF a much freer hand to deal with Hamas, and much more quickly than it was able to do before. So I think, we know what President Trump's 20-point plan requires, which is, first of all, the release of the hostages, largely achieved. Secondly, the demilitarization of Hamas and the deployment of an international stabilization force and the peace board to take control of, particularly of reconstruction of Gaza and putting Gaza back onto some kind of even keel. So that's the plan. My question is, and I know I'm not here to ask you questions, my rhetorical question is, who is going to disarm? Hamas is not going to voluntarily disarm unless a miracle occurs. And I'm not opposed to the idea of miracles. And that miracle could take the form of immense pressure being applied by the United States on Qatar, on Turkey, etc., to maybe force Hamas to do something that they really don't want to do and don't intend to do. If that's possible, it may not be possible. Let's assume it isn't possible. So who is actually going to forcibly disarm Hamas? Is a UAE force, Saudis, African, Indonesian troops going to deploy into Gaza and confront Hamas and take them apart, take their weapons off them? No, of course they're not. And not only would they not be willing to do so, they couldn't do it. How could they do it? What experience have they got dealing with a situation, anything like this? The tunnels, in large numbers of cases, are still there. Hamas still have a significant amount of fighting capability. So it's not going to be done by an international stabilization force. So unless this miracle occurs, the only people who are going to disarm Hamas is the Israel Defense Force. They're the only ones that are going to do it. No one else can do it. I think it's highly likely that's what's going to happen, because Israel cannot allow this rump element of Hamas to remain in existence, fully armed and prepared, and preparing, no doubt now, to redevelop its capabilities, to have another 7th of October when it, in a few years' time, when it recovers its power. Israel can't have that. So Israel has got to have Hamas disarmed, and it's only the IDF that's going to do it. As far as the broader governance of Gaza is concerned, undoubtedly there are plans that have been made and are being made to achieve that. And there's so many different options. I don't think until we get to the point of disarming Hamas, I don't think we're realistically going to see post-Hamas governance options laid out. And they can't really be properly decided upon until that does occur. And we know what the situation is when that arises. But broadly speaking, the plan is to have some form of governance, direct governance from within, from inside Gaza, from the Palestinian population, obviously not Hamas. And Israel is very strongly against the idea of the Palestinian Authority taking a leading role in that for reasons that we all know and understand, because the Palestinian Authority is equally as opposed to Israel as Hamas is, although their tactics and techniques are different, and they're not even capable of maintaining security in the territories that they control now in Judea and Samaria. So you can understand why Israel would oppose that. So we're really talking about people from within Gaza who are not aligned with Hamas, who are willing to play a role in the future development and governance of Gaza and the policing of Gaza. And there are people there who that can be achieved with, despite obviously currently Hamas's efforts to kill as many of them as possible. And then obviously there's going to have to be vast financial. I think an estimate I saw was something like $158 billion to get Gaza to the point where you could start building on it again. Because, of course, there's all these, not only the tunnel system, there's also huge amounts of demolished buildings. There's vast quantities of unexploded ordnance inside Gaza, whether it be booby-trapped or shells or whatever. All of that's got to be dealt with. It's going to take, again, an estimate I saw, $158 billion to get to the start point, and 38 years. So it's a long project. To my mind, the most realistic solution would be to achieve something like President Trump outlined before his peace plan of evacuating as many Gazans as want to go out of Gaza to temporary places in Egypt, where they could then hopefully live a relatively normal life, eventually returning to Gaza when it had been dealt with. But this is a very, very long-term project, and we're not going to see it, certainly in my lifetime. I'm not expecting to see it resolved.
You've described the Gaza conflict as Iran's war against the West. What do people need to understand about Iran's strategy and its objectives? And is it still a threat to the West after this 12-day war that we went through?
Yeah, I mean, Iran is, the Iranian Revolution was built on death to America, death to Israel. Those were the chants coming out right from the word go in 1979, and they remain the case today. And death to Britain as well, by the way. Britain, funnily enough, Britain's often seen as the most evil of all three of these Satans, great and little Satan. Britain, still in Iran, many people think Britain has the controlling hand behind American policy in the Middle East, as well as Israeli policy in the Middle East, which of course is not the case, but they still believe it. So, yeah, I mean, the Iranian Revolution and the revolutionary government in Iran today sees its existence in direct opposition to the West overall. And that's not going to change until the regime is changed, if the regime is changed. And I'm not optimistic that's going to happen anytime soon, despite how unpopular it is. But as to what Iran is capable of now, it's a very different Iran than 2 years ago. Iran has been utterly humiliated by Israel's defensive actions in response to Iranian attacks on Israel, not only the ring of fire, the deployment of proxy forces, including Hamas, Hezbollah, etc., around Israel, but also Iran's nuclear program and Iran's ballistic missile program, both aimed at Israel as well. But they have been defanged. The nuclear missile, the nuclear weapons project, with attacks by Israel and the United States of America, is now in ashes. not completely gone. There is still some highly enriched uranium, as far as I'm aware, still present in Iran. But it's going to take a very long time to resurrect it. And frankly, I would be surprised, and I hope I'm not being naive here, maybe I am, but I would be surprised if the Ayatollahs want to resurrect the nuclear program now. They've seen what the consequences are for themselves, for their international prestige, for their prestige at home. They've seen themselves utterly humiliated, defenseless pretty much against the United States and Israel. So I think they don't want a repeat of that operation. So I think we're probably unlikely to see, despite what they say and what they do are obviously two different things. I don't think they're going to return to the nuclear program while President Trump is in the White House and while Prime Minister Netanyahu is in the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem. The ballistic missile program is a different thing. I believe they are currently working to rebuild their ballistic missile program, almost certainly with the help of Russia and China. And that will have to be watched very closely. I think, again, Israel didn't completely wipe out Iran's ballistic missile program. Be very surprised if in some point in the coming months we don't see Israel having to return again to that particular fight in Iran. But I think not just Iran, also the whole of the Middle East has been reshaped by Israel and the United States over the course of the last 2 years, and it's been made a much, much safer place. Iran is obviously the primary example of that, but other countries as well.
You've predicted that Saudi Arabia will ultimately join the Abraham Accords. Are you still confident that this will happen?
I do believe it will happen. A lot of people don't recognize is that Saudi Arabia and Israel have an extremely close relationship now. They may not have diplomatic normality, but they are nevertheless very close as two sovereign countries. Saudi Arabia recognizes that its interests and Israel's interests are intertwined, as well, of course, as the United States' interests. So I think it's sufficiently close. And again, despite what they may say publicly, that we don't necessarily need formal diplomatic normalization. I think it would be good to have. And the reason I think it would be good to have is because it would then encourage other Arab countries and other Muslim countries around the world to follow suit, which obviously would be in Israel's interest and the interests of Middle East security. But I think it's likely to happen at some point. I can't say when. And of course, the Saudis, they will come out with, we've got to have a two-state solution, or at least significant progress on the route to a two-state solution before we will normalize with Israel. I don't think they're interested in that at all. I don't think that's the reality. It's what they say, but I don't think it matters to them at all. They know what the two-state solution, the prospects of a two-state solution are, which is zero. And they know that it would not be a good thing anyway, even if it were to happen. Good for them, or good for Israel, or good for anybody else. But they, for their own internal reasons and international reasons, they feel obliged to say that. And they might feel obliged to kind of stand on that territory for a while longer anyway. But yeah, I'm optimistic that we'll see not just a continuation of Israel's close relationship with Saudi Arabia, but formal diplomatic normalization, whether it be called the Abraham Accords or something different, I don't know.
Do you believe that Western civilization still has the moral courage to confront, Islamist extremism, the Muslim Brotherhood's effect on the West, or has it lost its will to defend itself?
Well, I'll focus mainly on Europe, if I may, because the United States is I think, we're in a different position in the US, and I'm sure most of your viewers and listeners probably know more about internal US politics than I do. But if we concentrate on Europe, I think Europe has lost the will to stand up for itself, to fight its own corner. And we've seen that unfolding over many decades. We've seen the European Union project, which is all about consolidating power in Brussels at the expense of national governments, a kind of European project that really is not based on any kind of national sentiment or any form of patriotism. It's based purely on this extraordinary European project, which of course has undermined nationalism and patriotism in European countries. And that is the strength that European countries have had in the past. Of course, it's been, in some cases, it's had very bad outcomes. We only have to think, of course, of Germany, particularly in the 30s. But it's also been the only way to actually strengthen European democracies and European values. And that's being progressively eroded. And we're now at the point where we've got, and I include Britain in that, although Britain left the EU, we're still heavily infected by EU thinking in Britain. And we're now at the stage where it's more important to be tolerant, to look for compromise, to look to appease other people, than it is to stick up for your own people. And while you've got that mentality which exists throughout, certainly Western Europe, I wouldn't apply the same thinking to Eastern Europe or parts of Eastern Europe. While you've got that thinking, all that's going to happen is that our countries are going to spiral downwards because our governments are not prepared to put Britain first or to put France first or something like that. They want to put the international agenda first and the agenda of appeasement first. And so the sort of short answer to your question, I suppose, is that I don't see any hope at the moment of Western European countries sticking up for themselves. And all I see is further dissent at the moment. Now, that hopefully will change. I'm sorry to have to say this, but I do see in Britain where our government is not even willing to take strong enough action to prevent floods of illegal immigrants pouring across the channel into our country, which endanger our country, not in every case, but in very many cases, it endangers our country and undermines our country. And it all has to be paid for by hard-pressed British taxpayers. And our government is not even willing to take action to stop that from happening. It's not been willing to take action to prevent industrial-scale rape gangs of underage girls across Britain predominantly by Pakistani origin Muslim immigrants in the UK. And I do sense increasing anger at this among British people. And they don't have the option any longer, and haven't had for many years, of voting to change this. Because both of the main political parties, Labour and Conservative, and this same thing goes throughout much of Europe, they have the same policies. You can't vote Conservative and hope they're going to have radically different policies to Labour. They won't. They've got the same policies. So people will, I think, as time progresses, I think people are going to, more and more people, it's only a small number now, but I think it'll grow. People will want to find a different solution that they can't find in the ballot box. And I'm very much afraid to say, and I'm not by any means encouraging this or relishing the prospect of it. I'm far from it. I've been involved in a number of civil wars in different parts of the world during my military service. But I do, and I know how horrific they are, but I do have an expectation that at some point in the future, we are going to see large-scale violence in Britain and in other European countries, which could well go to the extent of civil wars throughout Europe.
Colonel Kemp, I want to thank you for your time and for this eye-opening conversation that we had. Where can people find more about you or anything you'd like to plug? Any final message?
I have a website which is richard-kemp.com, and most of the stuff I write is published on there. And if anyone's sufficiently bored to want to read my writings, then please look at it on my website, or you'll find, if you Google me on the internet, you'll find a lot of stuff about me, most of which is uncomplimentary, but it's out there. The final thought I would leave you with, I think leave your viewers and listeners with, is despite what I've been saying, I'm extremely optimistic about the future of Israel. And, I think Israel is significantly stronger today than it was on the 6th of October, 2023, significantly stronger. And its strength is going to grow. Israel's got, I think, a very, very bright future, despite all the propaganda, all the lies that are told, and all of the setbacks Israel suffers. But I still believe that it is going to grow, strengthen, and flourish in the coming years. And the reason I say that is because I think Israel now recognizes, more than it did before, who its friends and enemies are. And it understands that it has to be more self-sufficient. It can't allow itself to exist at the whim of anybody, even its greatest friend, the United States of America. It has to do more. And I think actions are already in hand, advanced, to achieve that. Secondly, I think the Jewish diaspora around the world is more awake now, particularly after the horrors of the last 2 years, is more awake now to the need to support Israel and to be behind Israel, and particularly in the United States, the support of the Jewish diaspora is the most important thing. And so I think that will strengthen the country. And thirdly, I say that the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia, but other countries as well, like the UAE, have seen what Israel can do and have seen that Israel is willing to go to extraordinary length to defend itself. And I'm not saying that they're therefore afraid of Israel, because they don't need to be afraid of Israel, as long as they have no aggressive intent towards Israel. But they can also see in that, they can see their own interests against their own enemies, including Iran in the Middle East. So I think that strengthening of Israel in the Middle East is extremely important. And the final observation I'd make is I have the utmost admiration for the Israeli people and the way that they have conducted themselves over this war, young and old. But I'd say particularly, I'm not saying young more than old, but I particularly would comment on young people, because we see too often in the world, in the West, young people being criticized, and it's said they don't have the moral backbone or the courage of their forebears, which is certainly in Israel has been shown to be false. They've fought like lions. They've been extraordinary. I've witnessed them personally, many of them fighting for their country. And I think that is so encouraging. Any history shows us that any country that suffers from external attack and fights a successful war for its own survival is far more united and stronger at the end of it than it was at the beginning. And I think that's true for Israel. And I would pay tribute to all of the soldiers of the IDF who have been fighting this war, particularly the young people, who would probably represent more than any other part. And also the people back home who've been supporting them, who've been maintaining the day-to-day life in Israel in a way that I think few people would have thought achievable after such a long, protracted period of time. Sorry, I rambled on a lot there, but I'm extremely optimistic about Israel's future, and I have enormous admiration for Israel and the Israeli people.
I want to thank you for standing with Israel, with the Jewish people, for your moral clarity, for being the rare voice out there speaking the truth about Israel. And may God bless you and wish you the most success.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.